So, welcome to Raben's first town hall in 2026. Today's conversation sits at the intersection of mission, leadership, and the evolving reality facing the nonprofit sector. As many of you know, nonprofits are navigating a period of extraordinary complexity. Social needs continue to rise, political pressures are intensifying, and organizations are being asked to deliver more impact with fewer resources and often less predictability. Against that backdrop, conversations about mergers and acquisitions are no longer abstract or theoretical. They're becoming part of a strategic planning, long-term sustainability, and in some cases, just organizational survival. But unlike in the corporate world, nonprofit M&A is not simple as financial or organizational decisions. It's about mission alignment, community trust, leadership identity, and stewardship of people's lives and their livelihood. We also know that these conversations don't happen in a vacuum. Funders, policymakers, and community players play enormous roles, sometimes supportive, sometimes challenging, in shaping how and when organizations consider coming together. In a political climate where issues ranging from immigration to DEI to philanthropy itself are under attack, nonprofits need to think differently about collaboration, consolidation, and most importantly, resilience. We've brought together experts, I'm so excited, who have worked across the board with philanthropy, with government, with nonprofit leaders, people who have seen firsthand what it takes to thoughtfully explore a merger, to navigate an acquisition, or to decide that remaining independent is the better path. They understand the power dynamics that can arise, especially when funders encourage consolidation. And they understand the responsibility we all have to ensure that the community, not just balance sheet, remain at the center of these decisions. Therefore, I'm going to hand this over to my friend, Whitney, who is one of our managing principals at Raben, who will moderate the conversation with Gara and Cecilia. Whitney.
Thank you, Tanya. And just deep appreciation, Tanya, for all the work you do as our Chief Engagement Officer. So thank you so much. So today I am very excited because we have two people who I'm a little bit of fangirl on, so I'll just say that out loud. And so excited to have this conversation around merger acquisition, and we might also do a light touch on dissolutions as well, which is we recognize that in the nonprofit space, right, you're always usually seeking to scale impact. You're strengthening your organizational infrastructure, you're responding to shifts in policy and or funding. And really, this moment, right, both politically and others, is one where you really have to think about what do all those things mean and what do they mean for your organization. And while transformations sometimes bring trepidation, they also bring incredible opportunity. And so to really think about when there are, especially attacks right now, right, ranging from immigration to challenges to diversity, equity, inclusion, to, loss of funding, both public and private, but also shifting expectations around what people want and need out of the work that they do, but also the nonprofits and the services they provide. And so to really think about how are you positioning yourself as a nonprofit and whether joining forces or being consumed by someone else in a hopefully loving and caring kind of a way really will bring actually more force and strength to your work. And so the other thing, and which is why I'm glad to have Garrett and Cecilia here, is the complexity of funders, right? funders who both care about the work, are mission aligned, but also, if they put forth or suggest a merger or acquisition, bring a level of power dynamic to the table that is very different. And so to think about all of those things in this moment. But first, I want to introduce our panelists because both I like working with them and want you to get to know them a little bit more and to get their insights. So first, I'll start with Gary LaMarche. He's a leader in residence at the Colin Powell School for Civic and Global Leadership at City College in New York, where he teaches and co-chairs Leadership for Democracy and Social Justice, of which he is a founder. He also serves as a senior advisor here at Raben, so we get the privilege and joy of his insights, and board chair of the New Press, a progressive nonprofit publishing house, and also the vice chair for the Fund for Global Human Rights and Freedom Reads. For his nearly half-century career in human rights, social justice, and philanthropy. Don't give me that look, Era. It's an illustrious career. He also served as a president of Democracy Alliance and the Atlantic Philanthropies, but also the founder and director of U.S. programs for the Open Society Foundations, and his senior positions both at the ACLU, PEN America, and Human Rights Watch. Welcome, Gara. And then we also have Cecilia Munoz, who is an incredible national leader in public policy and public interest technology with over 3 decades of incredible experience, both in the nonprofit sector, but also 8 years of service on President Obama's senior team, which included 5 years of leading the White House Domestic Policy Council. She serves as an advisor right now to several nonprofits and co-chairs the Office of American Possibilities, a civic moonshoot factory that aims to solve public challenges across divides. But before working in government, Cecilia spent over 20 years at the National Council for La Raza, which you all now know as UNIDOS US, the largest Hispanic policy and advocacy organization here. And then she's also a trustee of Kresge, MacArthur, Freedom Together, and the Joyce Foundations, and serves on the board of several nonprofit organizations. And in 2020, she also published an award-winning More Than Ready, Be Strong and Be You, and Other Lessons for Women of Color on the Rise, which shares insights from her career as well as the career of other notable women of color. So, if you all aren't impressed already, I definitely am. And so we can dive in with thinking about, all right, how do we think about mergers and acquisitions? What are the trends that we're seeing? So I'd just like to open up right now to Cecilia and Gara. What are you seeing right now regarding mergers and acquisitions? And also, what are some of the trends that you've seen over the course of your careers in this space? Cecilia, you want to start us off?
Sure. I think it's a really interesting question, and I'm really grateful that Raven's hosting this webinar, especially at this moment. So I think, at least in my experience, mergers and acquisitions are pretty rare in the nonprofit sector. I actually think they're too rare in the nonprofit sector. I did actually go through one in an organization that I helped incubate just last year. In fact, the merger became sort of official and finalized at the turn of the year. So I'm sort of fresh out of the experience. But it's honestly, it's rare. And I think part of the reason that it's rare is that because there's so much, I think 2 things. There's so much friction that comes from institutional history, boards of directors, even funders, that it can seem like a letting go of an identity in a way that feels like a sign of weakness. And I actually think, especially in these times with so much turmoil in the work, so much turmoil in the funding sector, that it actually can be a strategy for strengthening a field. But it requires, I think, some presence of mind, some long-term thinking and planning capacity, which is really hard, especially in the middle of an emergency, which is what where we live right now. It requires that kind of long-range thinking, and I actually think it requires some institutional humility to think that maybe instead of a field with a dozen players who all have to differentiate, from each other in order to make their own particular pitches often to the very same funders, that it could be better for the work to consolidate some. And it means somebody has to sort of, if two organizations are merging and they're not creating something new, it means somebody's primary and somebody is secondary, and being in that secondary position is really hard and requires some humility. So I think there are big obstacles, but I actually think for nonprofit leaders, it's a tool in the sustainability toolbox that is underutilized. And if you know, you should be doing long range planning, even though, and perhaps especially because we're living in a crisis time. And this should be in your toolbox, absolutely, as a long range thinker and planner.
Yeah.
I would say I approached this from initially from a position of some regret. So I ran, big foundations for a number of years, and I have two regrets about my time in philanthropy. I have a lot of things I feel good about, but two regrets. And one of them I've written a little bit about, which is not the topic today, is that I didn't use the foundation's resources aggressively enough or creatively enough to help people diversify their revenue, right? So to get grantees out of the dependency on foundation revenue, that is a separate conversation that I wish I'd done more on. But the other thing I wish is that I'd been more proactive about mergers, acquisitions. I don't know, we could discuss that separately, but while you have that in the kind of corporate sphere, I'm not even sure exactly what that means. In the nonprofit sphere, it's hard enough to do a merger where people are threatened about their identity and autonomy and all of that without something that isn't desired by the group that you're merging with. But where mergers are concerned, I think there ought to be more of them. We can talk about why. Even one of the reasons I think is that funders are both a source of a way out of this problem, but also they cause it because very often funders who aren't really accountable in the broad democratic sense, they have founder syndrome themselves. They like to start organizations, they like to have their stamp on organizations, and there are plenty of organizations around. Theda Scotch-Paul calls, some NGOs associations without members, and has questioned the genuine base of a lot of NGOs. I think that's a little overstated, but I think that it is true that foundations play God a lot by creating organizations and have kind of proliferated organizations by that tendency. The conversation that I think should be happening right now is hard to have because of what Cecilia was talking about in terms of the emergency. Everybody is rushing to put out fires. Foundations themselves are under attack. It's a climate in which we need creativity and we need boldness, but we also quite understandably get people just trying to get from day to day with the communities that they serve. So I think one of the things this has exposed is the relative structural weakness of some of our institutions, and then the question is, what's the answer to that? Where is funding going to come from? Does it mean that we should be looking more carefully at the opportunities for greater impact by bringing people together? The only other thing I would say at the outset is I think I would want to widen the frame from mergers and acquisitions to the broader question of collaboration and alignment, because merger is like a marriage, and I guess an acquisition is like a forced marriage or arrangement. But I mean, it's like a marriage, and a lot precedes a marriage, right? And so I think that among other things, there have to be some history of comfort and collaboration, between organizations before you get to the question of whether they should merge. And I guess the other thing I would say is it's probably best for us to treat this on a continuum, right? So on one end of the continuum is two organizations become the same organization and figure out the leadership and figure out the governance and figure out the scope. But, there are also things that I've been involved with over the years and that I've encouraged people to consider that are short of full merger, but have to do with the shared resources in some way. So there's a lot of repetition in back office, operations for organizations that, could be combined. There's a lot of ways you can maximize your impact and kind of shepherd your revenues that don't necessarily, at least in the immediate term, mean a merger. That could be a point on the spectrum, and we need to talk about that. But also, I think you need to look at it in terms of how do organizations collaborate and align more to maximize their impact and to make the best use of their resources.
Thank you, Garrett and Cecilia. And Garrett, thank you for raising the question around acquisitions. And when I think about my time at Raben, there's been one or two, essentially what I would frame as an acquisition for a couple of reasons. One was sort of funder base, which is like, oh, small organization, get into bigger organization, it will help you. That creates its own complexities. But also, it's the acquisition is usually the recognition of size and scale,
Yeah.
which means there's usually one organization that is much bigger than the other one. And by sort of in part default without intention, it can be sort of consumed by it, right? Versus being very intentional about if you are essentially acquiring someone else, what does that actually mean for your own culture when you're the sort of bigger institution, but also what does it mean for the smaller one? And so having a more intentional focus when you talk about acquisition of also recognizing the inherent often power dynamics that exist in organizations of both different size, potentially different scale, different kind of impact. When they come together, what does it really mean when you have to account for that differentiation, but also the power that comes with that? And so I think to your point on the spectrum, Garrett, I'd like to drill down a little bit more around like when does something like this even make strategic sense, right? To your point, Cecilia, like, you're plugging along, you're doing your thing. Do you have the awareness of the landscape? Do you have an awareness of the organizational humility? Like, what are the things that you feel like need to be present to even entertain this kind of conversation?
Yeah, that's a great question. And the recent example in my history is as you just defined it, Whitney, is more of an acquisition than it was a merger. Although I think mergers are ultimately more common. But the size differential that you just described was exactly the situation. And I think the like essential ingredient, I think for all parties is thinking for a field as opposed to just for an organization, which is not an easy thing to do. I think it's more rare than it should be. I think, philanthropies try to think for fields, but it helps a lot and I think ultimately strengthens individual nonprofit organizations and coalitions if they're also thinking for the field. I mean, I've been parts of fields where we were fundraising for each other, which is a sign of strength. It's a sign of trust. It's only possible when there's strong trust, but it's also a sign of a strategy, right? Where multiple organizations understand their part in the strategy and they understand that the strategy isn't possible unless all of the players succeed, which is how you can end up in a situation where you say to a funder, actually, I need you to fund them. And so in the recent example that I was part of, I was associated with a small organization, but that had come into being because it saw a gap in a field and it raised the resources, demonstrated how to fill the gap, had some success in filling the gap, and then having kind of demonstrated the theory of the case, but was also sort of small and scrappy, was in a good position to be kind of absorbed into a larger organization that kind of got what the contribution was of the smaller one and really wanted to be part of continuing to fill that gap and bringing more resources to the table to make it sustainable over the long term. I will say that there were funders involved in that conversation, and part of what encouraged me as a board member as well as the leader of the small organization was funders basically saying, look, I think over time this is going to be more sustainable if you're part of a bigger thing. And we'll make it possible for you if you want to have those conversations. They didn't say you should merge with them or you should be acquired by them. They basically said, we'll give you some resources, explore it, see if something works. And if something works, we'll put up some money to make it for you to bring to the table so that it's not just a matter of, and I think this is when the conversation frequently starts and it's usually too late. Um, when it's a matter of, shoot, we can't figure out how we're going to make next year's budget. We got to find somebody bigger to absorb us. For the larger organization, that may not be much of a bargain unless it's clear how you can sustain the work over time. But I think thinking for a field is an essential ingredient here, and can be what brings peer organizations together to have this conversation, as well as this sort of more acquisition kind of scenario.
I want to just pick up on Cecilia's point about fields, and then I want to say a little bit more about what I regret not doing, in philanthropy. Um, with respect to fields, when I was the target of people's requests for support, I'd often ask somebody, almost always ask somebody, if it was a new organization to me or I didn't know that well, to just sketch out for me at some point how they see their organization in the landscape of the rest of the field that they're in. And sometimes those answers were very revealing because many people's instinct was to badmouth either very, very openly or as subtly as they could get away with it, the rest of the field, why they were unique in the field and so on. And, I generally did not think that was a positive for them. I think that people who have a sense, because we all know that whatever it is, whether it's immigration reform or health care or criminal justice, there's an ecosystem of groups. There may be too many groups in the ecosystem, that's a different question, but there's an ecosystem of groups that contribute to change. And you want groups that are collaborative and have appreciation for the role they play in the complementary role of somebody else. The person who comes in and tells me that they have the secret sauce and nobody else does, I'm suspicious of, right? So I think you definitely need a kind of a field-wide perspective and understanding that there's valuable work being done, not just by you. So this generosity that Cecilia was referring to, where you would even try to make sure that they, you raise money for your colleague organization. I think that's a really, really positive thing. To be more specific about my regret, and this gets to the question of the role that funders should play. On the one hand, I'm suspicious of foundations playing God and throwing their weight around, and I think there's a lot of examples of where that, hasn't been a good thing. But I was talking yesterday with Jeff Bloom, who used to run U.S. Action and whose organization eventually merged with another, because I wanted to refresh my memory in some of these of that particular merger. And he said that the idea of that he thinks funders have a really important role to play. That I think if I'm quoting him more or less, a hands-off funder is ultimately destructive to wise allocations of resources and power. So he takes the view that look, many funders, by virtue of the role they play in this ecosystem, have a pretty good perspective, if they're doing their jobs right, on the whole field, right? And they have something to contribute to it. And there's nothing wrong with the funder kind of being suggestive about it. And I've tried to do that over the years, not always with success. Because, as we'll talk about, there's a lot of things that get in the way, ego, institutional identity, things like that. But what I specifically wish I had done, because I headed some very large foundations where you could have done this, is make funds available for people who want to merge. I don't think in general, you can do much to make people, merge, or should even. But a lot of the obstacles have to do with resources, ego, identity, all those things. But also it can be costly, at least in the short term, to actually do this. And I like the idea very much of what Cecilia was saying. I may even have made a couple of these kinds of grants myself over the years to give people some money to explore it, right? But what would the world look like if a big foundation, said, we've got, I don't know, $20 million or $50 million, whatever it is, set aside every year to be available as a kind of a bank, for mergers. You come to us, maybe we'll suggest that you ought to think about this. You come to us if that's something you want to do, and it liberates people to think a little bit differently. They're not scrambling around for resources. It's not, in general, I think you want to merge to create greater impact and strength. And you in not in, and most of the time when you get discussions about mergers, it's because of weakness. It's because of the failure of sustainability and so on. And sometimes that works out and you have assets that are valuable even if your finances aren't in the greatest shape, but often it doesn't, and it's now no favor to anybody to have the weak merge with the weak. I think that when I was talking to Jeff about the merger of what now is called People's Action out of US Action, I don't remember off the top of my head what the other group was called before the merger. um, he was talking about it in terms of a very thoughtful process where one group had more kind of political savvy and capacity, and the other group had more of a multiracial base, and they both saw the strengths. And very often in an organized, in most of my experience with successful mergers has been in the context of power building organizations and organizing networks. And those, they have to think about power a lot to begin with. That's the business that they're in. And they also are pretty clear about the bottom line that we could increase our scale and therefore our impact if we did this together, which doesn't mean that there aren't a million issues to work out, but that's the right kind of mindset for it. And the other thing that Jeff said to me that made an impression on me was that as you create inevitably a somewhat larger organization, there are different leadership opportunities for people, that are created. And sometimes talent that has no natural place to go in X organization might have a place to go in X plus Y organization.
Thank you, Garrett. And Cecilia, I'm going to sort of follow up because Garrett answered my other question simultaneously, which is thinking about like what distinguishes a successful merger? Like, what are the sort of pieces or elements that you feel like really help to not drain resources, but actually expand and get to scale or impact or things like that? Like, what have you seen?
I feel like I've been going first every time. Gar, should I give you a chance
Oh,
to jump?
I like batting cleanup.
You're good at it. You're good at it.
I'll go ahead.
Um, I mean, I would say first and foremost, um, respect for the contributions of each institution and the sort of whatever the unique qualities are that they bring to the work. I think is actually really essential, especially because of the power dynamic that you described, Whitney, earlier. If it's a smaller group kind of merging with a larger group, and the larger group, you have to figure out who's going to be the board chair, like which board chair is going to step back. Um, are are some board members going to step back entirely and not be on the board of the new entity? Which executive director is gonna lead, and which one will step back? And what do you do with all the staff roles? I mean, that's complex stuff. And it is infinite, not that it's easy ever to have these conversations, but it is infinitely easier if you're starting from a perspective of trust and respect for what everybody contributes to the field. And that's again where I think thinking for the field, thinking like if the North Star for the work is really clear in the process, then that's the thing which should be guiding decisions, not ego, not even resources or even institutional standing, but like a common understanding of what's actually going to advance the work in the long run. But that's really hard to do, and it helps a lot if people the individuals making these decisions agree to be guided by the same North Star. I think it can be really helpful to have some facilitation, especially if it's sort of a merger among equals. Again, in the case that I just worked with, it was a smaller group and a larger group, but they were all on the same page with respect to what matters. What's the gap that the smaller group is filling? The leader of the smaller group especially was super careful to reach out to like 100% of their stakeholders to make sure everybody was on board. And what they learned was that some of the stakeholders really wanted to hang on to the institutional identity and brand that had been built. And the larger entity was comfortable doing that. And that turned out to be very important. But like the respect, collegiality, and clarity on mission and North Star, I think are essential.
I
Awesome. Okay.
totally agree with that. I mean, there's a guy, David LaPiana has written a lot about mergers and involved with mergers, and I've learned a lot from his work on this. And there's a paragraph in a blog post that he did a couple of years ago. And one of the things he writes about, elements of success. And, I won't name him, but there's a world leader who could learn a lot from this approach. He says, don't threaten your partner even if they are weak. A threat to autonomy, identity, or other critical, deeply held values will kill a merger effort. Approach the other group respectfully in a manner that allows its leaders to save face. The merger process must provide a way for the mission, individuality, and the culture of both groups to be valued and incorporated into the new entity. Fear of change, loss of autonomy, individual egos, habits, and culture all cause nonprofits to avoid mergers. I think that's absolutely right. And I would say further that two things. I think and again, you can overplay the marriage analogy, but I mean, what do you need for successful marriage? You don't necessarily need complete compatibility of interests, tennis versus movies or gardening, whatever. You do need shared values, shared basic values. And also I think with organizations that we've mostly been talking here about organizations that Cecilia and I have both been more associated with, which tend to be kind of social change organizations, advocacy groups. There may be different considerations for service delivery. It's not my world as much, but where you're talking about social change, they have to have the same basic theory of the case. That would be, I think that would not be a very successful merger if their approach to how change takes place in the world is too different. And I also agree that although I don't have a lot of direct experience with it, that it's hard to imagine a successful merger without some external facilitation,
Yeah.
where somebody is helping to guide them through it. Final thing I would say that I don't think has been said yet, although it's been alluded to, because what we're calling ego or brand or identity or power, I suppose, institutional power is often an issue here, particularly in the board level. I think you need a moment. I mean, let me put it this way: the most auspicious moment for a merger is when there's a leadership transition taking place already, because it's much harder to merge two organizations, both of which have a CEO who are going to stick around, and then you have a question of, are you going to have a co-CEO situation, which can work, but it can be difficult if there's no history of it. Are you going to have one kind of subordinate to the other? All that is tricky. When you have a retiring leader, you have a natural opportunity for it. A little harder on the board level, but sometimes if a board person is leaving their seat, boards are a little easier to merge, I suppose, but on the staff level, I would look for what George Soros used to call the revolutionary moment, where you have a natural transition point that might make it easier for these two organizations to come together. Excuse me.
Thank you for that. Um, I'm going to now, Cecilia, appropriately start with Gara for this question.
All
So
right.
then you can do cleanup. Uh,
Great.
so, Gara, as you were talking, especially about sort of the role of funder, right here, and your sort of one of your regrets to like make funding available and stuff, but I think I'd love to hear a little bit more about what the role of funder maybe should be here, and also maybe what funders shouldn't do when entertaining or engaging in merger acquisition discussions.
Yeah. Well, the example of what they shouldn't do, it doesn't come so much from a failed merger, but I have seen funders, including funders that I respect, and it's possible that I've even done this, or people working for me have done it. But is trying to push people together into something that doesn't they wouldn't naturally gravitate toward, which doesn't mean you can't suggest you should be maybe you ought to think about working with this person over here, and you should talk to them, and if you want to work with them, we'll be happy to provide some support for it. But I've seen funder collaboratives around some social change issue. I mean, for instance, it's so long ago, and the foundation is defunct now, and I think that my friend Bob Crane, who ran the foundation at the time, would even agree with this. So I'm not telling tales out of school, but it was a point where, inspired by some of the work that Open Society had done on felon disenfranchisement, or restoring the vote to people in prison, the newly created JEP Foundation created a collaborative of organizations to work together on this. And basically what they did is they picked the organizations, they required them to work together. They didn't at various points have entirely the same theory of the case, or even want to work together that much. And it didn't work that well, which is not surprising. Like the equivalent of that in the merger is, don't play God, be available and be supportive, and you can be a little proactive, because like the best funders, with all the kind of critique that I and others have made about funders' abuse of their power, or the power dynamic, which is real. The fact is, there's a lot of people in philanthropy who come out of movements. They understand them very well. They're quite respected by the groups that they deal with. They have to be careful to understand what's their role and what's somebody else's role, but the best of them are. And they could be honest brokers, and so I don't know whether the facilitation role that I've suggested can be played that well by a funder who's also, where there's a power dynamic. I think you have to hire, a consultant or a firm or something to help with it. I don't know that the funder itself can be the facilitator of the process, but they can start the process and be available through it. Because the best thing, at their best, funders have good funders in the field, and Cecilia and I have seen this, particularly I think in immigration, on and off over the years, but also in criminal justice and other places. Those people, some people enjoy the trust of the community, and they also, the great thing about being in philanthropy, if you're doing it well and respectfully and as humbly as you can, is that you have a field-wide view that often is not available to the individual players. When I was at Human Rights Watch, I thought that, I had respect for other groups, but I had a very Human Rights Watch centric view of the world, which, by the way, Human Rights Watch has always been a little guilty of. All big organizations kind of think that they're the center of the universe. But when I left, I realized I saw the world a little differently, because it wasn't from within the organization, it was from without. And so I think there's a lot of knowledge there. So I think the funders can be a great resource, obviously financially, because in the I think it's the case that in a successful merger, there are costs associated with it. Here's the thing not to do. I think this should not be motivated by desire of a funder to save money, to put two organizations together and give them the budget for one. Maybe over time, and there should be over time, some economies of scale involved, but it can't be motivated by, it needs to be adequately resourced and capitalized. That's what I think is the big missing piece here, is a source of available capital to facilitate mergers. It can be coupled with encouragement, suggestion, other kinds of support. But the lack of capital for this that's dedicated, I think if you had a foundation or a consortium of foundations declare this to be a goal and make money available for it, you would see, it would liberate people to think a little differently in a way that they cannot think that way now.
Thank you.
I completely agree with that. And in fact, one years ago conversation that I was involved in relating to this was from a group of funders that sort of quietly suggested to some major organizations that were in the same field, we'd be willing to put money on the table to urge you to consider merging. But it was very clear it was because they didn't want to have to write 3 checks or 5 checks. They wanted to write. It was just really for their convenience. They weren't thinking for the field. They weren't necessarily thinking about advancing goals. They were just, it was about their own convenience. These were corporate funders, by the way. So no knock on sort of traditional philanthropy. But I completely agree that that's sort of relatively bad behavior. Um, and I think, and I see also in the Q&A that there's a question about like, are there resources available to, like, is there a pool somewhere to help people think about this? And to my knowledge, no. I think it's pretty individual. Um, it's the kind of conversation, that I, as a person connecting nonprofits, would have with my own funders to see, again, if I thought this was a possibility or might be a reasonable element to explore as part of a longer strategic plan. That's the thing you take to your funders to say, look, we're prepared to consider this, but we could use some help figuring it out.
Yeah, thank you, Cecilia. And I'll probably pull on one of the questions that sits in the chat just sort of right now, which is just overall consolidation, right? And thinking about a field, what are the benefits to potential consolidation? Especially when you have, maybe a collection in that field of smaller organizations that, while are having an impact, are not able to do it at scale. And so to think about what is that may be worth doing if you want to actually consolidate a field. Would love your thoughts.
I,
You
I
first,
think
Gary.
that, yeah, I think that the the issue is going to vary a little bit by field. So I don't have the view that we just need a bunch, one big organization. My late friend Herb and Marion Sandler, they had a theory of the case that each field needed a dominant group, kind of an alpha group, And as a practical matter, when you look at some fields, that is the case. But it often isn't. If you look at the environmental movement, there's whatever, 4, 5, 6 organizations. I'm not deeply enough in that movement to know, to be able to articulate the market share ecosystems that those groups have. But I am more familiar with other areas. So sometimes, you can have a smaller, scrappy organization that really plays an important role. I don't, is catalytic to the field. I don't have the bias necessarily that there needs to be one big union, in every issue. I do, however, think that the uh, funder funders often drive differentiation in ways that are not always healthy, right? So that is to say, they create things, they add to fields maybe that don't need the other group. They don't look at what's there already. I mean, I use an example from philanthropy that always made a big impression on me, whatever you think of the Gates Foundation's work. When Warren Buffett decided to be philanthropic, at a certain point in his life, whatever it was, 10, 15, 20 years ago, he could have created his own multi-billion-dollar foundation and hired a staff and done all those things. He had looked at what the Gates Foundation was doing, which is already obviously a behemoth foundation. So you can ask, maybe you can think the Gates is too big and this isn't a good idea. But what I liked about it conceptually was Warren Buffett said, I think you're doing a really good job on issues that I care about. So I'm going to give you $40 billion, whatever it was, and I'll sit on the board. He didn't create another infrastructure. When I was when I went to Atlantic from Open Society, we were dealing with, as Cecilia will recall, a lot of post 9/11 civil liberties issues for, Patriot Act and freedom of expression and attacks on South Asian and Muslim and Arab communities. And, at Open Society, we were doing a pretty good job on that, I thought, partly because we had resources, Ann Beeson and Mort Halperin and R.A. Nair and Steve Rickard and maybe me, or people who actually been in the civil liberties field. We knew a lot about it. It was hard to assemble a more talented group of people to do that. When I went to Atlantic, I said, it caused great shockwaves at the time. why don't we just park our strategy behind them? Why don't we just back that? Why do we have to reinvent the wheel? It didn't go over so well initially because people have a lot invested in their own separate things. And so I think that, the Buffett example I think of very often about that. I think so I don't have an unerring bias for bigness, any more than I like, there's independent bookstores and there's Amazon, right? So, but having said that, I do think we have too too many organizations chasing too few dollars, and the sustainability of those organizations has been laid, or the difficulties of sustainability has been laid bare recently. And I think it's a good time for a conversation about not business as usual. What do we need to do to break out of this? And I know foundations have a lot on their plate and nonprofits have a lot on their plate, but this may be precisely the time, to ask the question of how they could add up to a more powerful whole.
Yeah.
I agree with all of that, and I just let me foot stomp Gara's point that the it's different field by field.
Right.
And so on the one hand, there is a lot of value to smaller organizations which are doing particular elements of a thing and doing it really well. But it's also worth asking a question of, is there a whole here that's greater than the sum of its parts? And are we, able to move the ball forward, in not just on a piece, but is the whole moving forward? And if it's not moving forward, is that because we're too differentiated, right? So in some cases, but it depends on the players, like 100% of the time. There's an argument to be made about large organizations moving forward an agenda with effectiveness. In some cases, that works really well, and in other fields, it doesn't. And you have behemoths that it's pretty hard to point to what they're accomplishing. So I think it's a very individualized. I can't say there's one theory of the case. I mean, you need a mega organization in each field, or that smaller organizations are always better because it's going to vary field by field.
Yeah, it's a great flag for both of you. Like, my in my original sort of first career was right in the environmental sector, and thinking about how the environment sector, the bigger sort of green groups or bingos as they're lovingly referred to often, and then also the environmental justice sector, which have very different impacts, very different scales, both critically important but function in very different ways. But when they overlap and when they do it well, it has true impact at scale. But when they don't, it really creates fractures and sort of challenges for both the field, but also the impact and the transformation we want to see, especially as we see it sort of now in this moment. And so I think it's worth always asking the question of, like, also, not only is there like the merger and acquisition, but also do you need to build up a field because it actually needs to then work really holistically and collectively, and it actually needs to look different than it did before to actually have the impact we want. I also want to just flag for everyone who's in the conversation right now that we do have a wonderful set of things in the chat. Michelle's given a great resource. Ellie shared a really wonderful example of where sort of a small organization really has significant impacts on policy and funding because they're very focused and very tangible. And so would like to, hopefully folks keep bring in those conversations to this one, and feel free to keep peppering in questions as we go. I'd like to get to another thing, especially given the current climate from both of you all, is given this current right political climate and the scrutiny that folks are under, whether it's fields, organizations specifically, funders, is there a risk to really also thinking about mergers or acquisitions in this moment, given the potential heightened scrutiny that organizations are potentially coming under for their work or who they're connected to or the kind of money they get from whom?
It's a really interesting question. I think one risk, honestly, is distraction. That, right, if in this moment, there's lots of reasons for the right organizations to consider sort of joining forces and putting more resources to the task of to the work at hand. But at the same time, orchestrating a merger just is going to require, by definition, a ton of time from the board, a ton of time from the institutional leaders, which is time that they're not spending on the work of the day. That is the challenge with that is, of course, that is always going to be an obstacle. Like, we may be in a crisis time now, but like I've been at this for a lot of decades. There's never been a time when the work didn't feel a great sense of urgency. So that's always going to be a crisis, but I do think the getting caught up in what I think of as like internal stuff, operational stuff, organizational stuff, um, is one risk. I actually think, if organizations are well run, right, if they have the infrastructure to make sure that their T's are crossed on their and their I's dotted, and that could actually be a real benefit to a merger. Scrappy smaller organizations often struggle with this stuff, and more established organizations frequently have systems so that the leadership doesn't have to worry from day to day about HR stuff, or making sure like payroll gets out on time. So I think it's a mixed bag. Again, I think it's a very individual decision. Um, um, and I actually think, right, you could be mitigating some risks by making sure that as an organization grows, as a movement grows, or a field grows, that you are taking advantage of the institutions that have built in-house capacity to stay on the right side of all of the lines. But at the same time, there is a risk of just getting so absorbed in the who's going to do what after a merger that you lose the thread for the moment.
Yeah, Cecilia, I was talking with someone, and then I'll let you go, Kara, around like really creating a small team that focuses on this and not having it sort of consume the whole organization, but to really be very strategic about who is it truly engaged in this conversation and how do you keep it tight so that the mission can still have an impact while also transitioning this. Gara, please go on.
Well, there may be issues about timing, and distraction, but I guess that my overall mantra for any of this would be, it's always about the work, what best serves the work, right? And so that may be acting now, even in the middle of a crisis, and maybe it means, you put it off a little bit. I think to the scrutiny question, I hadn't really thought about it. I mean, look, we're living through a time where the kind of corporate mergers are under great scrutiny because we have a kind of a mafioso government, right? And so one of the reasons we've seen such cowardice in the corporate media sector in particular is that all these folks who want to merge Paramount and CBS and Amazon has a vision for this or that, they need the approval of government. In the ordinary course of things, that is not so closely tied to the ego of one person, right? And so that's they've been able to be brought to heel because they need something in the way our corporate media works that they have some reason to think they're not going to get if they don't kind of toe the line. I don't know that we're in the same situation. I don't even know, honestly, what the regulatory I haven't thought through what the regulatory aspects of this are. But to the extent that the IRS would be involved, yes, it probably opens up an additional degree of scrutiny. That's something to think carefully about at this moment. It's a good question to ask, and I hadn't really thought of it that much. There's one other thing that I wanted to say well, two other things. One is, it is possible for a smaller organization to kind of locate itself to some extent within a larger organization and not lose its identity or brand, but realize some benefits from the collaboration and the back office stuff and so on. So there's a lot of different ways to do this. And you see it in publishing, for instance, which is a world that I'm a little bit more familiar with, or that I am somewhat familiar with, where an imprint, there may be some kind of a merger and there's an imprint, and the editor still has their imprint and there's something on the book. And people don't tend to buy books because of their brand. I mean, they don't, it's not the way people buy books, but there's some analogs in other places. And the other thing I was going to say is that, a danger that we haven't talked about is, particularly for an organization that is acquiring or is the bigger organization into which smaller things are being merged, there has to be a thread that you can understand of the story of that institution and why it makes sense to acquire this or that. And years ago, there was a big national think tank organization that kept acquiring or other smaller groups. And I had trouble, and I frankly said to the director of it, I have a little trouble understanding why you're doing all this, because it seems to me that, they relate less and less to what I understand to be, your strategic mission. And I'm losing the storyline a little bit, here. Maybe other people are as well. And so I think that, there has, look, some institutions like universities grow and build because money's available, and all of a sudden they have a center for this, and their overall. Um, there are some kinds of institutions that can add, wings to their house all over the place, and somehow it works, right, because they want to do it. It may be a nonprofit organization that has to raise money from foundations and individual donors has to have a coherent story. And if your mergers or if your growth dilutes that story and dilutes your focus. And again, there's analogs to this in the corporate world of people who, went beyond their core business and did something that failed. So there's a nonprofit version of that as well. You have to have it. It has to make sense for the overall story, coherent vision, integrity of your own organization.
Well, with 3 minutes left, I'm going to start closing us out. And first, I want to just say a deep thank you to you, Cecilia and Gara, for several things, but I'm going to try to encapsulate them pretty quickly. One is just think very carefully around mergers and acquisitions, what you're doing, the power dynamics, but make sure you start with a level of both respect, a North Star for the work, facilitation support if and when you need it, shared values, considering brand and or identity, and then for funders really to think about how do you capitalize the effort, but also create a space and container for these conversations to happen and then support it when and how you need. And then sort of closing out with a couple of things. I want to go back to one of your first comments, Cecilia, which is like organizational humility. As an institution, how are you really thinking about where you are both situated in the field, but also the organizational humility to think about what do we need to become or what do we need to be a part of as part of the broader field? And then also the story of self and the story of us on your sort of closing thought, Gara, which is like, how do you tell the story of an organization? How does it flow and evolve? But also, as you're thinking about a merger acquisition, how do you tell that story so that its continuity retains? And then I'll close with this thought, which is something you both said more implicitly sometimes, but occasionally explicitly, is the mission focus, right? Of how do you retain that mission and vision and the impact you're having in a conversation around a merger acquisition, and using that as the forefront for this conversation. So both of you, thank you.
What a wonderful summary. Thank you, Whitney.
Well, this is why you're so good at what you do, Whitney. That's like you demonstrated that, and like why I'm such. Is there such thing as a fanboy? Are there fanboys as well as fangirls? I don't really know the whole terminology, but if
You
there
can
is,
start it now.
that's why.
Sure.
That's why I'm such a fanboy. All right.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all. And for folks on the webinar, thank you so much for joining us. Feel free to connect with us if you want more information at info@raben.co. We obviously have social media, Facebook, all those kind of things, and we'll make sure we send a recording out. So, Gara, Cecilia, thank you again. Have a wonderful rest of your afternoon, folks.
Thank you.